first and foremost, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from Washington, D.C. from me, but I know we have attendees from all over the United States and some actually from out of the country. I'd also really like to thank our panelists today, Camille Bismonte and Max Courval, for their time and their insight that they're going to share, and as well as conference organizers, our amazing tech host, Ashley, and our incredible assistants, Jeff and Miranda. As a quick reminder and ground rules, just letting you know that this panel is being recorded. There will be a survey at the end, which is how you'll be able to enter into our raffle. We'll paste the link in the chat, and it'll also be in the pop-up window after you leave this webinar. And you can also open the Q&A box and submit your question at any time. You can direct it to Camille, to Max. You can also ask Jeff, who's the Boren staff representative, or you can just ask it generally. And with that, we're actually going to get started with Max. Max, are you good for screen sharing?
Yes.
All right, awesome. Take it away.
Awesome. Hello, everybody. So excited to be here to present today about the Critical Language Scholarship. Just to give a little introduction about myself, I am from Gilbert, Arizona, and I recently graduated from Arizona State University with a Bachelor of Arts in Geography. And I received the Critical Language Scholarship in 2020 to study abroad in Florianópolis, Brazil, to learn Portuguese. And because of COVID-19, my CLS experience was virtual, but I still have plenty of insight and information to gather for you. So the Critical Language Scholarship Program is a summer study abroad program that is designated for US students, both undergraduate and graduate students, in all fields that are interested in studying critical language. Another important aspect is that this is a fully funded program by the US government, so everything for the trip is paid for except for your passport. The purpose of the Critical Language Scholarship Program is to teach languages abroad that are less commonly taught and studied on US campus, but these are also deemed critical to our engagement with the world and to US national security and economic prosperity. And these languages also prepare US students to compete in a globalized workforce and work for companies that are working in a variety of areas around the world. The languages that are offered to study by the Critical Language Scholarship Program are, there are 15 languages. On the left-hand side, there are 9 languages that require no previous study of the language. Those include Azerbaijani, Bangla, Hindi, Indonesian, Persian, Punjabi, Swahili, Turkish, and Urdu. So as you can see, these languages really cover a vast expanse of different continents, different places in the world, and these 9 languages require no previous language study in that language. On the right-hand side, there are 6 additional languages that are required that have some prerequisites of language study, whether that be study at a US university classes, personal classes, or at home self-taught. Those are some of the ways you can meet the prerequisites. For example, for Arabic, Korean, Portuguese, and Russian, 1 year's worth of language study is required to apply for the Critical Language Scholarship. And for Chinese and Japanese, at least 2 years of previous language study is required. And if you need any more specific prerequisite information, those can be found at clscholarship.org. So a bit more into what it means to be fully funded. So the Critical Language Scholarship is fully funded, and that includes your domestic travel to Washington, D.C., where there is a pre-orientation before you leave for your actual program site in the summer. It also includes round-trip international airfare between your hometown and your program site. This also includes any applicable visa fees, housings and meals while abroad. This also includes all your classroom instruction, any cultural programming, and group trips. And you also are able to receive undergraduate academic credit through Bryn Mawr College, which can be transferred back through your to your university, your host institution. A little bit more about the structure of the CLS program. Each institute, we call them institutes, each program site, hosts up to 30 CLS students, and everyone shares the same weekly schedule. You might be divided into different language levels, and you might have different classes, but you will share the same weekly schedule, which is 20 hours of language classes. And then to complement those language classes, you will have cultural activities and local excursions at your program site. And there are also maybe 1 or 2 weekend overnight group trips. The purpose of this program is really designed for language gains and cultural immersion. And that's really evident in the fact that you're not applying for a country, but you are applying to a language. So if you apply to Arabic, you might be placed in Morocco or Oman, or if you apply for Chinese, you might be placed in China or Taiwan. And to go along with that, there is also a language policy while you're abroad, and that you must be using the language at certain designated times in class, on cultural excursions with your host family. And most students do live with a host family. Some may live at an apartment with a local student, but most students will have the opportunity to live with a host family. And all students have a language partner. You are paired with a student who may be from your university, your host institution, who will be able to practice speaking your language. You'll be able to learn some more informal language. You'll be able to learn a lot about what it's like to be someone of like your generation abroad. And I think that's probably one of the most beneficial experiences as well. CLS comes with a lot of program benefits. The most primary benefit is that you make really rapid gains in your language skills. For example, I studied Portuguese in the fall virtually, and I was able to jump from advanced low to an advanced mid. So I was able, and that was only in about 7 to 8 weeks. And you're also able to advance your career in because many US companies are wanting to give advantage to candidates with language skills, are seeking candidates who can speak multiple languages. And studying abroad also builds not just language skills, but other skills involving problem solving, communication, and other kind of soft skills that you can employ. And you're also able to build a lot of international relationships. Once you go abroad, you now have this host institution abroad that you can consider yourself a student of or an alumnus of. You're able to learn how to communicate and collaborate with people in cross-cultural settings. And once you come home, you have a network of very successful alumni who have also been part of the CLS program, who may be interested, who have studied the same language, or maybe they studied a different language, but they might have similar academic and professional interests. And it's a great way to network and get to meet other people. The application for CLS opens in the fall, and ideal candidates come from all academic disciplines and from all backgrounds. CLS is very invested in representing the US abroad and showing the diverse communities abroad at home. Ideal candidates also want to demonstrate that they understand that this is an academic and language intensive program, but in spite of that, that they are prepared to exceed in this setting. Ideal candidates also show that they are excited to begin or continue learning a critical language. For someone who might have not learned one of the critical languages before that don't require prerequisites, maybe previous language experience and how you were motivated to learn one language, that can be applied to show how you will be successful at learning this new critical language. And for others who have already studied the language, showing how you have dedicated to studying this critical language in the past and how you will continue and be successful moving forward. And then you also want to make a clear connection between your target language and the future career plans. I think it's important to note that CLS wants this opportunity not to be the end of your language learning journey, but it's really a stepping stone to other opportunities. And they want CLS almost to be a springboard into other language opportunities and professional academic opportunities. For more information, you can go to the CLS website to find information about eligibility, criteria, language levels, and prerequisites. You can watch the CLS application tips video, which is on YouTube. And you also might be able to find some campuses will have advisors who specifically advise for fellowships, national fellowships like these, and also your study abroad office. And you also might be able to seek language faculty at your campus who will be able to advise you in crafting a successful application and how your language might be intertwined with your academic and professional goals. Like I said, applications for next summer, 2022, will open in the fall of 2021. I wanted to share a few photos from my experience. I did CLS virtual, but it was still just as I really enjoyed the experience. In the right-hand corner on the top, that was my language class. We met 3 days a week online virtually for Portuguese. This is my advanced class. On the bottom right, this was me and my language partner, Deborah. We got along really well. We had so many common interests, and we would speak, we'd practice Portuguese like 2 weeks or 2 hours every week, which was really great. And then one of my favorite in the bottom left was one of our cultural activities where our program director, Mariwale, taught us how to make Brazilian feijoada, which is a black bean and meat stew dish. It was really delicious. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Max. That was really insightful and well organized. We do have a few minutes for your allocated time before Camille starts. And so just really quick, Max is a current alumni ambassador for CLS, and I am a former CLS alumni ambassador for Indonesian. Of course, I did it a few years ago when I could go in person, and Max, I really do hope you get to go to Brazil or another Portuguese speaking country soon. But I am wondering if you could talk a little bit about the logistics and the studying environment, the learning process of your virtual institute. As you may have seen from the CLS applicants Facebook group, there were a ton of questions from alternates, finalists, and just people who are curious, who also may be attendees. So congratulations to those who are watching, who are awarded. So Max, did you just kind of recap? I understand that it was a little bit of a condensed program, but you didn't really lose anything in terms of quality of contact hours, right?
Right. It was definitely more condensed. It was about 10 hours a week as opposed to 20. Because it was in the fall, they understood that other students were studying still at their university, but I still felt like I still was able to jump up a level in Portuguese, which I really think is a testament, even though it was condensed, the level of instruction and immersion online is still high quality and will allow you to make these language gains. And also you're able to have this cultural immersion as well through the activities they plan.
Yeah, so Max, you're calling in from Arizona.
Yes.
I'm in Eastern Standard in Washington, D.C. It's also where Camille is. So how did the logistics of time zones work out? At least the Americas are somewhat, close to each other.
Right.
But for some of our attendees who may have been accepted or are alternates for a program in Asia, that's a pretty big time difference, even if you're on the Pacific coast. So talk a little bit about how you balanced, school, life, home, COVID, and also your virtual institute.
Yeah, the virtual institutes, they're very understanding of, our demanding schedules, and they adjust to our time, thankfully. They adjust to teach classes between 1 p.m. and 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So in that regards, they are very, willing to accommodate our schedules. And I really think that they were really gracious with that. And so it might be very late for them where they're teaching, but thankfully it's, they're able to accommodate us in that way. And with COVID, I think that it really had helped me to have this community of language learners, meeting regularly. And it felt like I had a group of people I was interacting with daily, which was really helpful.
Those are all really good points and really good tips. We can only do so much while we are in our homes, but hopefully, next summer or even for study abroad programs, maybe next spring, people can go abroad. Is there anything like a quick anecdote you want to share, or we can go to Camille?
I think,
good?
Yeah, I'm good. Camille would be great. I'm excited to hear.
Yes. And we already have a bunch of Q&A questions. So just a reminder for all of our attendees, please continue submitting questions into the Q&A box. And we're really excited for audience Q&A time. Camille, are you ready to go?
Yeah.
All right, awesome.
Max for presenting, and thank you, Helen, for hosting our panel on your birthday. So Thank you. And also Helen, similar to Helen, I was also a CLS alum from 2018. And then more recently, I was an alum from Boren for their Indonesian Flagship Language Initiative. So let me share my presentation for Boren. In the capacity of this conference, I'm going to talk a little bit more about Boren, what it is, and just kind of clarifying the different kinds of Boren Awards available and all the different projects you can do. And so just to give a quick overview of the Boren Awards, it is an undergraduate scholarship or graduate fellowship, and there's up to $25,000 for overseas language study. And there's a preference for less common languages and destinations. So preferred destinations are in Africa, Asia, Central and Eastern Europe, Latin America, and the Middle East. And popular languages include Arabic, Mandarin Chinese, Portuguese, Russian, Hindi, Korean, and Swahili. And the Boren Awards places a strong emphasis on public policy issues related to US national security and select applicants interested in pursuing careers with the federal government. And Boren Awards alumni receive preferential hiring consideration and exclusive opportunities for government jobs. In fact, right now there's the Boren conference for the career fair. So eligibility for these programs, this is me with my host mom when I was in Indonesia for the second time. She was the same host mom I had in CLS. You have to be a US citizen. You have to be planning to study a foreign language in an eligible world region, which we'll cover a little bit more later. And you have to be matriculated at an accredited US institution or applying to graduate school. So applicants may apply for the Boren Fellowships while also applying for graduate school, but they must be enrolled by the time they start their Boren funded programs. It is also possible for recipients of the Boren scholarships to apply for and receive Boren fellowships as graduate students. So let's say for me, I did a Boren scholarship while I was an undergrad. I could apply hypothetically again if I enter graduate school as a Boren fellow. So that would be two different awards. And Boren scholars may use their awards to fund self-identified programs such as university arranged study abroad programs. And Boren Fellows may receive funding for traditional language programs or self-designed combinations of research and language study. But both Boren Scholars and Boren Fellows may instead apply for the Boren Organized Flagship Language Initiatives. So to kind of, there's a lot of acronyms here. So AFLI stands for the African Flagship Language Initiative, which funds the study of French, Swahili, and 3 other indigenous languages. SAFLI, the South Asian Flagship Language Initiative, which includes Hindi and Urdu, and the Indonesian and Turkish languages, IFLI and TURFLI, each have a flagship language initiative for their study. Let me click the next slide. So this is a little bit more of a breakdown of what the awards amount to. Before, Boren scholarships and Boren fellowships had different levels of funding. However, now they've kicked up this past year the amount of funding that is available for Boren scholars. And for specifically, I also wanted to mention that the Boren prefers programs that are 25 weeks or longer, although undergraduates in STEM fields may receive funding for programs of 8 weeks or longer. So that's just kind of another little different tidbit to mention. So kind of going back to the preferred countries, they're in Africa, Asia, Central and Eastern Europe, and Latin America. To note, the countries in gray over here mean that the countries of Western Europe, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand are never eligible for Boren Awards funding. And as of the time I took this screenshot, countries in blue are not likely to be approved in 2021. This most recent cycle just ended. And so I don't know if this would change within the next year for the upcoming cycle. So like I said, subject to change by the 2022 Boren application cycle. So to talk a little bit more about what exactly are the preferred languages that they're looking for, there is no minimum or maximum proficiency requirement for most languages. Exceptions would include French, for example, for AFLI, in which you would need an intermediate high proficiency for French. And you want to be sure you can set realistic expectations for proficiency gains and select appropriate programs, especially if you're going to be doing self-study. You want to make sure that your programs cover the language requirement for Boren scholars. So you want to make sure your program is definitely more language intensive. And then they also should be languages should also be studied in countries where they're widely spoken. So this is, I'm going to stay a little bit over here so you can see what kind of preferred languages they have for the Boren Scholarship. So please note that for all languages indigenous to preferred African countries are considered preferred languages, but there are too many to list individually. But French is only a preferred language under the African Flagship Languages Initiative, which I'll cover later. And French is not a preferred language for self-identified programs. Please note also that for Latin America, they only have 2 preferred languages, Haitian Creole and Portuguese. And rarely applicants receive Boren scholarships for the study of Spanish or regional indigenous languages, but they must articulate an especially strong national security argument and plan for federal service. And suggestions of, let's see here. And then for Boren Fellows, kind of go back into that instead. Any matriculated graduate student pursuing a master's, doctoral, or professional degree, as well as anyone applying for one of those degree programs, may apply to fund a program of overseas study that meets the requirements detailed in this presentation. So for the most common kinds of Boren fellowships, I would say they were self-designed programs, which is the most common type of funding for most of our popular languages, such as Arabic, Mandarin, Chinese, Portuguese, Korean, and Russian, and research in these countries where those languages are spoken. Boren Fellows can receive a maximum of $25,000 or up to a year of overseas study. And applicants proposing research should also submit a brief research abstract as well as a statement on their research methodology focusing on institutional affiliations and or official authorizations that will permit them to conduct the research. Additionally, if for Boren Fellowship applicants who are planning to conduct research, internships, or academic study beyond foreign languages are encouraged to attach a letter of overseas affiliation to their application. As far as like the degree of what a letter of overseas affiliation means, they may be traditional letters or brief records of email correspondence, and should demonstrate that the applicant has discussed the basic parameters of the arrangement with their proposed overseas host institutions. And kind of similar, so now we're going to be covering the flagship language initiatives. As we had mentioned a little bit earlier, there's a lot of different ones, but mainly all you have to remember is that they're fully funded. There's US university credit. Oftentimes, unlike the CLS, which is specifically through Bryn Mawr, the US university credit will come generally from the domestic institution that is hosting your program. So for example, for me, I did the Indonesian Flagship Language Initiative, which meant that my university credit came from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. A little bit more about specifically what universities, we'll talk a little bit more about what universities are hosting what programs. But yeah, so generally there's a summer domestic intensive language for all levels, followed by a fall overseas intensive language with homestays. Usually that summer and fall program combined would land you at about 6 months of total instruction, but you are able to also apply to continue for continuing language study or continued like research fellowships or research projects, for example. For me, I personally did my Indonesian Flagship Language Initiative from summer until fall. And then for the spring semester afterwards, I did an internship in Jakarta, Indonesia. But yeah, summer and fall programs are arranged by the Boren Awards and have all the necessary costs funded directly. And so basically, as far as the application, applicants to these countries and languages simply indicate that they're applying for the applicable Flagship Language Initiative on their Boren Scholarship or Boren Fellowship application. So it's not as complicated, I think, when filling out the application compared to like making your own self-designed project. And all other application essay instructions are the same for self-identified programs. Participants in the flagship language initiatives receive transcripts for college credit in the language study from the hosting or sponsoring US universities. And similar to the CLS, it's also a language intensive program, and you'll cover roughly a year's worth of language in under 3 months. So it prepares beginner students to arrive at their overseas program in the fall, where they are prepared to communicate in the target language. As far as the summer programs, because they're usually hosted in universities, summer program participants are housed in university dorms and receive campus meal plans. And for the languages of French, Swahili, Indonesian, Urdu, and Turkish, scholars and fellows will continue their study in overseas programs during the fall that are also arranged by Boren. And for the overseas program, these programs include homestays with local families, including a private room in the household for each program participant. And so then you also get that intensive language acquisition by interacting in the day-to-day with your host family. All right, so to be done with that, we're going to continue and talk a little bit about the specific languages. So for the African Flagship Language Initiative, there are several languages. This program covers 5 languages, actually. 2 of them, French and Swahili, include summer and fall programs arranged by Boren. The other 3 include a summer intensive domestic program, but require participants to find their own overseas language programs. So for this one, for French, this one is in Senegal. Similar to what I said before, there's a summer and overseas program, but the special thing about this is the only program where you can use French, and but it requires a French proficiency of intermediate high or above. For Swahili, it's going to have that summer domestic program, overseas program in Tanzania, and then you can continue if you'd like in spring, and there's no language proficiency prerequisite. And for the 3 other languages, Akan, Twi, Wolof, and Zulu, there's a summer domestic program at the University of Florida, and there's self-selected programs over here as well. So the other 3 languages are covered by AFLI or a hybrid of the Boren Organized Summer Intensive Language Program and self-identified programs in Ghana, Senegal, or South Africa. And it's open to all applicants of all levels, and their customized instruction will prepare both Boren scholars and fellows to arrive in the country with a strong foundation in a major indigenous language, Senegal for Wolof, or South Africa for Zulu. And so the overseas program must be around 12 weeks long and are language intensive, but overseas program funding depends on duration with the program of 25 to 52 weeks. And is eligible up to $25,000. Okay, next, this is a photo of my friend Julia when we were in Indonesia. So Indonesia is also a summer domestic program, an overseas program in Malang, Indonesia, where Helen also lived during her CLS, and it's in conjunction with American councils and the State University of Malang. Similar to the other languages, there's no language proficiency prerequisite. And so, yeah. Hindi is part of the South Asian Flagship Language Initiatives. And so there's a summer domestic program at UW-Madison and an overseas program in Jaipur, and no language proficiency prerequisite. Oh my goodness, oops. It looks like I didn't include Urdu, sorry. But for Urdu, it's also a summer domestic program in UW-Madison. And similar to the other structures of the other programs. Lastly, we have TURFLY, which is the Turkish Flagship Language Initiative. And so that's a summer domestic program at UW-Madison, an overseas program in Baku, and there is no language proficiency prerequisite as well. And kind of the last thing that's a really important part of the Boren application, I always hear a lot of questions about, specifically when I'm mentoring people who are trying to do the Boren application, is how do you build a budget? That's another part of this application, and oftentimes it just seems a little confusing. So I'll focus a little bit more on what's included and what's not. So what's not included is passports, vaccinations, dependents, and personal travel and entertainment. But the other things include flying to the country, all your program tuitions and materials. I guess the last thing I want to mention about building a self-designed program budget is that underestimating your costs will not make an application more competitive. You have to remember that the part of the funding for the Boren is that they have allocated this amount of money for each scholar. And so I would say be realistic, but also don't be afraid to ask for more, because while you're doing your application, it's not going to affect your application. I personally was trying to like skimp on medical insurance, for example, and then I was like, why am I doing that? So that's one thing I just added on to. And for self-designed program budgets, it's not necessarily that you have to always make it by yourself. If you look for the Flagship Language Initiative websites, for example, they actually have a specific breakdown of the amount it costs. So you can just copy and paste basically what they wrote into your budget sheet. As far as finding an eligible program, you still have a lot of time. The next round of applications will probably open in late fall, and then will close in either January or February, depending if you're a scholar or a fellow. So 2022, you have plenty of time to start now if you'd like. So yeah, basically contact your campus representative early in the process. I've put down 3 different websites that you can definitely look at. But these are just suggestions of university-sponsored study abroad programs that can qualify for Boren funding, or know of programs used by past recipients. And if you don't really have a campus representative to ask about this, or maybe they don't know enough about Boren, I think a great place to start are professors of language and area studies at your institution, who may also be able to suggest overseas host institutions or know someone in the country. But to reiterate again, it must be a language intensive program. And so, and it must meet the requirements for Boren, which I think should land around 20 hours of instruction per week, but maybe might be less than that, but that's what it was for IFLI. So I think that's it. So thank you so much. And yeah, that's the Boren.
Thank you, Camille. That was really, really insightful. In your last minute of time, I'm going to ask you if you had to pitch a flagship institute over, like a self-designed program, what would you say are like the 2 most attractive qualities of a flagship program? Besides structuring as well. Yeah. And yeah, there you go.
Yeah, so basically for flagship languages, I was so used to having a program like the Critical Language Scholarship, because it was language intensive, and similar to Max, I had some really immense language gains. I started off as novice low, so that meant I basically didn't speak the language. I wasn't sure why they made me take the test, because I was like, I don't speak. But afterwards, I was intermediate high coming out of the Critical Language Scholarship. Similarly, by the time I came out of Boren IFLI, I actually had raised myself from advanced low to advanced high. So that was still really awesome for me for language gains. I would say like this program specifically for IFLI was very similar to CLS. It was quite literally the same university, same teachers. So for me, I was like, well, I already knew like the efficacy of this program, so I might as well come back. I know one of my friends ended up not going through IFLI and ended up doing like a similar language intensive program through the same university, and she turned out fine also. I think it just depends on the amount of flexibility you want. I think for me, I really enjoy programs with structure, and then also there's that additional community where I'm not learning this on my own. And so you kind of have that other solidarity of like struggling to learn the language. And I think it was just easier to hold myself accountable. I noticed by the time I went to Jakarta to intern, I was already advanced high, and so a part of me didn't take language acquisition as seriously. I still had classes one-on-one with my professor 3 times a week for a few hours, like for 2 hours each, I think. But even then, my like priority was more of my internship and like finding those deliverables there rather than focusing on my language gains. It might have been like a combination of maybe I just wasn't holding myself accountable, or it could have been another combination of like I was already advanced high, and so I was like, I like all too lazy to like learn the other ones. But yeah, so that's a little bit on that.
So to summarize, it sounds like with flagship programs, they're usually lesser commonly taught languages, so it's harder to find, study abroad providers or even direct enrollment for like lower level. I know that you went into IFLI pretty advanced, but for maybe if someone was intermediate level or novice, it'd be pretty hard to do the direct enroll option. So it sounds like structure and being a good fit for what you need. Sounds like some
Like
pros for a flagship.
Oh yeah, sorry. I guess one last thing on IFLI was that when you came to the critical language scholarship, although I think there was a lot to be gained by being thrown directly into the country, and I still love this CLS, I think it was definitely a lot less daunting for people in Boren coming into Indonesia because they already had 2 months of full instruction and cultural knowledge of like the country before they went in, and so it wasn't that much of a surprise, and it wasn't probably wasn't as jarring to arrive rather than like with this domestic preparation before going into CLS before going
right.
into Indonesia.
That's a really good point about Wisconsin. Some of my professional sorority sisters did the Swahili program, and they were at University of Florida and had a really good time getting the basics and then transitioning as a group to Tanzania, which is quite the change with Florida. Okay, well, thank you again to Max and Camille. I also want to give a shout out to Miranda and Jeff, who've been doing an amazing job managing Q&A. For attendees who are watching on mobile or on desktop, please make sure you click on the little Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, and you can actually open up the list of questions we already answered. We have a bunch of questions about eligibility, competitiveness that you can read, and feel free to submit a follow-up question that we can, further discuss. But one question we got from Abby, who advises on CLS for students at their school. Abby said, I find the connection between language and future career is the most difficult for students to make, and asked for tips or suggestions on how to make that connection. So I'm going to quickly give my little tip, and then Max will share his response next. And Camille, if you want to also pitch in, you can just use the raise hand function. So actually, even though I did CLS and then I was alumni ambassador, I applied in 2014 as a sophomore to Azerbaijan, which is very different than Indonesian. At the time, I was studying Russian and French in college and was a Central Asia concentration for my bachelor's in international affairs. So it was all fit together. But now with nearly 7 years of wisdom and experience, I look back and my career aspirations and essay response was just so not attainable. It was not specific. It was not realistic. It wasn't really tied into public diplomacy or international affairs. I was a very precocious and eager and well-meaning sophomore applicant to a very, very niche language, but it was too intellectual. Like I wrote about all these things I wanted to research, which it's not really relevant to CLS. But then senior year, I was actually the TA for political Islam, and also TA'd Indo-Pacific security challenges. I had really shifted to Southeast Asia at this point, and my essays were good enough to be an alternate. And then I was promoted 10 days before the program. And here I am now. So just wanted to share that even people who don't make it past semifinalists or make it to alternate can still go on the program. There is hope. But Max, now on to you if you want to share a little bit about your experience. And I believe you also applied again this year, right? So if you want to talk about both times, actually.
Sure. Well, I've applied 3 times, and I think that was my biggest struggle as well, was making the connection between my language aspirations and my career. Because I applied for CLS Portuguese for the first time in 2018 when I wasn't awarded the scholarship. And I think part of the reason why I wasn't awarded was because I didn't make the strongest connection between my language goals and my academic and career goals, which is also kind of hard for a lot of students, especially like, freshmen, sophomores, and even juniors who still may be unsure of where their end of their degree might be, let alone where their next, what they might want to do for their career. But I think what helped me, and I would advise this for any scholarship, whether it be Boren, CLS, Fulbright, Talk to professors both in your language classes and in your major classes and ask about, international opportunities abroad in your field that might pertain to your language or pertain to your major. For example, I was studying geography and urban planning, but I also was really interested in Portuguese and Lusophone and Brazilian culture. And so one of my urban planning professors, I was talking to him about urban planning abroad in like the international sphere. And he told me about the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy, which advocates for sustainable urban transportation. Their headquarters are in New York City and Washington, D.C., but they have offices in Brazil, in Mexico, in Kenya, in many Southeast Asian countries. And so I think that was one way which I was able to see, okay, how I can connect my language goals of Portuguese with, my goals of working in a, sustainable development that was related to my geography and urban planning.
So I hear from in both of our responses being specific and realistic
Yes.
are important.
And you don't have
Max
to like
also
have it
wanted
all
to
mapped
highlight-
out.
Mhm. Yeah.
Right.
But you mentioned sustainable development. That's technically STEM, and STEM or even STEAM, right? Art are pretty important to government program priorities these days. And so people who, I'm sure there are tons of, political science, international affairs, regional and language studies students who are huge pools of applicants for these programs. But we have been getting some eligibility questions from a number of medical and public health students who are really interested, and that's amazing to see. Engineering students, right? Doctors Without Borders, Engineers Without Borders, these are all really well-established professional networks. And also you have non-competitive eligibility status, which is a special federal hiring pathway, or like a boost, a leg up in your application process that also gives you access to a very diverse field of government jobs that you can use your language skills, your cultural knowledge, and your degree. And so let's see. In terms of our next question, and what we should have time for about 2 or 3 more questions. So this is really the time to enter any more Q&A submissions into our queue. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the recommendation letter process. I believe that is something needed for both programs, and also something that I know a lot of students struggle with. That's usually a big barrier, at least anecdotally, what my friends and people in my network have told me in terms of making sure they actually submit their applications. Camille, do you want to talk a little bit first about your rec letter process? You can talk about Boren, but feel free to touch upon CLS as well. And then Max will go to you after.
Awesome. Yeah. So similar to you, Helen, and I was also an alternate to CLS Indonesia, and they let me in. Actually, so I'll talk a little bit about my 2 experiences with CLS and Boren. One, because I think CLS I had a beginner's experience, whereas for Boren I already had some more exposure to the language and knew who to ask. So for CLS specifically, I had 0 Indonesian knowledge. I had never studied the language. At best, for Southeast Asian languages, I was a heritage speaker of Tagalog because I'm Filipino American. And so what I did was I was also a Spanish minor in college. And so I decided to ask one of my Spanish professors to write a recommendation letter for me to talk a little bit more about my language prowess. And then, so that was one recommendation letter for the CLS. So just to talk about my dedication to language study, for example. And then the second recommendation letter I had was from my economics professor. And it was kind of a reach. It was because for his class, we did a lot of case studies on Indonesia, specifically pro-poor policies in Indonesia, when he used to be director of research at the World Bank in Jakarta. So he always talked about Indonesia. And so it was to that extent that we've been talking in office hours about it. And so I asked him to write a letter of recommendation because that was aligned with my statement of grant purpose, I suppose, in those essays. Similarly for Boren, I asked, I think quite literally the same econ professor to write a recommendation letter. And then for my language professor, I'd switched it to my Indonesian professor. I think for the most important thing about recommendations is not about, I always hear from students that I mentor at Global Community College transfers if they should pull a professor that's necessarily exactly what their major is. Choose a professor or like a person who knows you best and can speak about your character. Although it is important to have something that's kind of related to your major, it doesn't have to be that way. I know, for example, for economics, I personally am not close with every economic professor I've had, but I am close with every Spanish professor I've had. It's just the nature of how my college career went. And so for me, it was really important to have people who knew me best and have been a mentor. So that way they can definitely talk more about like interacting with me. And so I would just say, give them enough time. Sometimes I think the best thing for approaching recommendation letters, this is my last thing on it, is know what you're asking from them. So for me, there's a lot of resources in CLS or Boren, for example, to say what they're looking for in a recommendation letter. And so I hand them those like PDFs for that. And by the time I ask, I usually also have my essays in tow. So that way they can write a letter that's kind of related to what I was going to say. So I don't want them to talk about like, oh, her dream is to do this, even though that wasn't what I mentioned in CLS or in my essays. So you want that to be aligned. Congratulations, Michael. But yeah, that's my last thing on recommendations.
Max, want to share some brief tips as well?
Sure. Always important to ask early and ask with plenty of time to give your professors to write a recommendation letter, because the worst thing you can do is ask a professor like 2 days before the deadline and please, I know it's late. Like, no matter how gracious you can be asking, it's really important to ask in enough time in advance so that they're able to write the strongest recommendation letter possible. And it's also important to ask, not just think of who can write a recommendation letter, but who can write a strong letter of recommendation for my program. And so you really want to think about, create a list of professors you might want to ask, and then narrow it down based on how well you know that professor, how well it relates to your application and your career goals. And I think from there, you'll be able to, because I think really the letters of recommendation can really make or break an application.
Okay, so I'm going to try and squeeze in our last question, our last minute or so. A reminder to stay until our Zoom session closes, as you do want that survey. Miranda, if you could paste it into the chat as well. So our last question that we can get to today, and thank you so much for all these amazing questions, is a question about someone who wants to, apply for a language that isn't offered at their school. What do they do? And so we've covered a few of those tips and tricks, finding people like an economics professor who you had case studies with on this region, also asking early. Camille, Max, do you have any advice on that? I mean, for example, Indonesian is probably not offered at Georgetown or GW, and Portuguese, I think, is offered at Arizona. So maybe both of you can touch upon that very briefly.
I would suggest, looking into other ways to learn the language, or at least, interact with native speakers. For example, there might be some, language classes or someone who speaks the language fluently in your area, and they might be able to offer classes. There are also a lot of great online resources that you can look into that might be low cost or no cost or free, such as there might be Italki, where you can take classes online with a teacher, a native person. So I think CLS also really rewards creativity and ingenuity when it comes to previous language study. So if you're showing that you really do want to study this languages and you've taken initiative, even though it might not be offered at your college, you've taken some sort of initiative to interact with the language, I think those will be really beneficial to your application. And then in turn, you'll be able to actually learn the language in a more formal environment through CLS.
Yeah, kind of to talk about what Max said. Yeah, Italki is a really great program to use, and it's fairly affordable to like learn languages and then be able to talk to speakers in the language you're studying. As far as like programs, I guess ask around, because you'll always find Facebook language groups for these kinds of programs. I think for Indonesian specifically, the Indonesian embassy in Washington, D.C. happened to have online Zoom classes for free for intermediate and advanced speakers or even beginners. And then similarly, there is other programs run by alumni of the CLS program or Boren program who are running kind of like conversation tables. And so I guess like as an alumni of the program, I would totally recommend just grabbing a few of your other alumni and then making like a little conversation table. So if there are not always opportunities at your university or institution, feel free, like make your own. And also, especially with this work from home situation, it's so much easier to find like online classes for free or these online communities of people who are like-minded and want to like learn languages.
Those are all excellent points. And thank you again, both of you and our wonderful staff, attendees. Thank you as well for joining our first session. And I will see you shortly because I am moderating the next session.